Hello, and welcome back to our series where we are building a people and culture management system. This series is brought to you by Prairie HR Solutions. My name is Jake Finger, Principal Consultant here at Prairie HR Solutions. And in this video, I would like us to start doing some calculations on our scatter plot data here. So if you haven't watched our previous videos, I would suggest you go back and do that so you kind of know what we're talking about here. The last video, we created these two input boxes here, and these are disabled, so they just receive and report out data and input, not necessarily receive it from the user. And what we're going to want to do is essentially find the average of whatever data we have here in our scatter plot, as well as the average salary and the average experience. Now, when we think about doing analytics in HR, we tend to find the average a lot. So we find the average salary, we find the average, tenure, the average time to fill. So the average comes up quite a bit. And we could, every time that we want to do something with this cell, of course, we could write that line of the block of code to find that average every single time. Or what we can do, and this is the approach I'm going to take, is we're going to create what's called a helper function. And this function, the sole purpose of this function is to simply run the average. And that way, if we are trying to find the average for the salary, we just send the values over to that function. The function does its thing and then returns the average. And then the experience, we would send it to the same function to do the same thing and return it back. And what we're going to use, if you watch the previous videos from our channel, we did this previously with essentially just a regular loop. And this time we're going to use a method called reduce. And what a reduce method does is it iterates over an array, and its sole intent is to take that array and turn it into one value, so to speak, one element. And if you think about really calculations, particularly our average, the average is simply a sum of all the numbers divided by the length or however many numbers there are. So you're taking a bunch of numbers and giving one number back. So that's why we're going to use reduce. It's pretty versatile, especially when we're doing calculations. So let's jump in and do that. Let's come over here to our code. And this is our analytics code here. And since this is going to be a helper function, what we may do is put it down here in our utilities. But for now, let's just create it. So let's put it right up here at top. And let's call this function, let's call it what it is, calculate average. Now, there's nothing to say that once we start doing other calculations or other analytics that we can't use this same function and just write an if statement based on our parameter. But for now, we're just going to do the average. If we ever need to do further, like regressions or anything like that, we can use the same one, same concept anyway. So now when we think about averages and particularly division, we cannot divide by 0. So if we pass an empty array here that doesn't have a length, that has 0 elements in it, we're going to eventually try to divide by 0. And that's going to throw out a pretty nasty error. So, and I'm telling you this because it's from experience. I did this quite a bit a few years ago, and I was like, okay, I just need to, first things first, take care of the 0. So how we can do that is write simply an if statement. And what we're wanting to check is whatever parameter in the form of an array of numbers is being passed to this function. So let's just call whatever that's going to be, whatever those values are, let's just call it values. And what we want to check is the length of that value of this whole array. How many elements are in that? So we can simply type values.length, and if that values.length equals 0, then we want to do something. We don't want it to divide. We want to simply just return 0. So what we're doing is we're telling it not to divide anything. We're just saying, just return the number 0. And let me write a comment here just so those that are following along can know what this is for. Manage if array is empty to avoid throwing an error by dividing by 0. There we go. So we took care of that one. So now let's get into our reduce, our actual calculation. So I'll create a comment here. We'll say use reduce to iterate over array accumulating the total sum. And what we're going to do here is create that variable, create that sum. We need a variable to store all of these values coming in. So what we're essentially doing is we're starting at a number, and that number is obviously going to be 0 because we want to start at 0, and then we want to add the first number in that element to that 0, and then the second number to that, third number to that. So if we had 1, 2, 3, it would be 0 plus 1, which is 1, 2 plus 1, which is 3, 3 plus 3, which is 6. So we need a variable to store that. Let's just make it a constant variable and call it sum. And what this sum is going to do, it needs to iterate over the array of values that's being passed to it. So we need to call on the values, and we need to simply reduce that. Now reduce, there we go. Now we can see it. The reduce is going to receive a callback function, and we'll use an arrow function notation for this so we don't have to call out function and all that. And what it's going to want is the previous value, which we can call ACC because that's really what's going to be happening to it, is going to be accumulating, adding on to this previous value. Then it's going to want the current value, and let's just call that val. The current index we're not really going to need, and we're not going to need the array because we're giving it the array value. And the one thing that we're going to need is this T number. And this T number, what it's asking for is where are we going to start? So let's start typing this out. The first thing we're going to need is that previous number, which we're going to call the accumulator. And then it's going to need the current value, which we're going to call val. And then what we're wanting to do with this, because remember, reduce isn't specifically for averages. So we have to tell it what it is that we want to do with this ac and val. And since we're finding the average, we want to take the previous number and add it to the current number. And what this is going to do is it's going to essentially keep a running sum for however many elements there are in that array, and then store it in this sum variable. But now we need to give this T value. So if we scroll down, you'll actually see what that T value is. The initial value. So we want to start our calculations based on 0. So now what this is going to do is it's going to sum all the values and store in variable. So now that we have this, we have the sum. Now we need to divide it by however many numbers or values there are in that array. So let's create another variable. Let's just call that average. Now the average is going to be equal to the sum divided by however many values there, and we already found that by this values.length. So we need to divide this by the values.length. And then this function, what we wanted to do is to return that average. So now whenever another function creates a array of values and we want to find the average of that, we can simply pass that variable, that array, to this function, and it will do that for us. So let's test this out. What we can do is just create another test function here. And let's give it some values. And the values here, let's just go 10, 20, 30, 40, 50. Yep, pretty original. Took some thoughts. And then we want to find the average, obviously. And when we put something in a variable, well, here, let me type this in here first. What we're going to want this variable to be equal to is whatever this value returned is from this function. So we want to call that function average. And the value that we're going to want to put in here, this doesn't necessarily need to be value. This can just be, we can call this even array if we wanted to. And there we go. And what we're wanting to pass to this function as the values is this array. And that's going to be stored in this variable average. So we could take this variable average, break it up and populate it. We could, well, not break it up, it'll be one number currently, but we can take it and do other things with it depending on what our need is. Let's log this average variable out. And then let's save this. And then let's call this test calc average. We'll run it. And it's going to log that variable, and the average is 30. So now say we want to go back here and let's just change this. Let's give it another number, 60, and then run it. And it'll be 35. So what we've done is we've created a helper function to where all we need to do is pass an array to it, and it's going to kick back the value of this, and we can store it in a variable to do something else with. Again, you can change this array to anything, and it will find our average. So now the reason why I did that is because with Google AppScript or JavaScript, what we have to do is we have to tell it how many decimal points we want, because it's just going to keep going. And as you can see, this 0.333 infinity, it will get to a certain point and then either stop it or just round it. Here it looks like, way out here it finally ends, or they just rounded it. But that doesn't necessarily help us when we're wanting to find the average salary. We don't need the millionth of a cent. And the same with the experience. We don't need it drilled all the way down in the decimal places over here to where we're trying to find the minutes and seconds. We just simply need 2. So what we can actually do is we can use toFixed. And what the toFixed method does is it determines how far the decimal places go. So what I mean by that is you can type in toFixed, if I can spell it right, and you can see the number of digits after the decimal point must be in a range of 0 to 20. If we leave it blank, the default is 0, but what we would like is 2 decimal places. So now if we save this and then run it again, we won't have the 3333 all the way out. We'll have it to 2 decimal places. And one thing that I'd like to point out here is let's let's erase this and find a situation in which it will have to round. So see here, 34.166666. So if we cut it off at the second decimal point, what we would typically do would be to round this. So let's use 2 fixed at the second decimal place and see how it handles the rest of this. And there's a reason I'm doing this, just to illustrate something that we should be aware of depending on how your individual organization actually handles the rounding of that third digit. So you'll see that it automatically just rounds that second digit up based on the third digit. So this is something that we need to be aware of because some organizations just do the floor. I mean, if the third digit, it doesn't matter what the third digit is, it's going to be just dropped off. There's going to be no rounding whatsoever. And then I've also seen other organizations that if there's anything in that third digit, they go ahead and round it up. I particularly see the rounding come up in payroll instances. And depending on what your current practice is, you may or may not need to handle this in a different way. And you can handle this by setting a math floor, and maybe we'll get into that with some of our other calculations. You can use the math method to set the floor, which means it just drops that off. And if not, then it doesn't. Actually, let's go ahead and do that. Let's go ahead and take this to fixed to a math method just real quick so you can have that in your examples should you need it. So what we can do here is let's just keep using this test average thing here, and we'll just handle the rounding or not. So let's get rid of this to fixed. And how we can handle this is let's just look at this average piece here. And well, actually, no, let's just create something. Let's just create some logger logs here. Let's just do it this way. Logger log. And then what we're going to do is math.floor. And that math.floor is going to need a number. So let's just say 4.777. And if we're going to take this to the second value, then it would obviously be 8 if we rounded it. But what we did is the math floor, and that math floor is going to drop that thing completely off. So let's go ahead and run this here real quick. You'll see it's going to produce our average. And this log we had, if you remember right, we had this log of 4.777, and anything after the decimal, it appeared to just drop off 4.0. And even if we did 2 fixed after this to 2 decimal places, it's still going to round up, or it's still going to just drop off everything below this 0.77. As you can see, it takes it out to 2 decimal places, but it just drops off any decimal place. So that is math floor, no rounding. And one thing before we do the other version of that is let's look at this as a negative number. So if it's a negative number, it works kind of in the opposite direction. So let's run this again, and you'll see what I mean. So if it's a negative number, it's going to round up to essentially the lowest number. And since -5 is lower than -4, it's going to go ahead and take that down to 5. So that's one thing to keep in mind with positive and negatives, depending on if you're doing financing and whatnot. So now let's figure out the other way, to where if you make $4.01 an hour, you're going to get $5. And how we would do that is math dot seal or ceiling. And let's do 4.11. And then we'll also do 2 fixed because it works the same exact way. Round up 2 whole number. And this one, we can just say round down 2 whole number. Okay, so now let's run this and see what we got. There you go. So regardless of what this is, it's just going to go upwards to the next whole number. And regardless of what this is, if we're using floor, it's just going to go to the lower whole number. So it's just essentially going to cut it off or take it up to the next high number. So that's going to be an important piece when we're dealing with compensation or payroll or anything like that, based on what our business practice is for consistency. So we now have a helper function to run all of our averages. I'm going to end this video here, and in the next video, what we will do is we will call our calculate average values and return the average and then populate it in these 2 fields here. So what we will need to do initially is to grab the salary based on all these, and then grab the experience based on all these, and then average that up. And if we think about how it is that this is coming over to us, it's coming over to us in, oh, wrong one, my apologies. It's coming over to us as an object. So what we're going to have to do is to dip into that object and then turn that into an array of values, which is not as hard as you think it is, but, or it may sound, but we can handle it that way. So I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope it was informative. If you do appreciate and support what we're doing, please hit that subscribe button. And until next time, please take care.